By the summer of 1916, the Eastern Front was frozen in tense anticipation. After the heavy defeats of the previous year, the Russian Empire had managed to regain its strength and was preparing for decisive actions. The railway junctions of Stryk and Kovel acquired key strategic importance. Control over them opened the way deep into enemy territory and the possibility of cutting the enemy's front. Located in the swampy terrain of Volyn Polesia, these small towns became the center of attraction for huge armies. The Austro-Hungarian command perfectly understood their value, transforming the surroundings into powerful fortified areas with an extensive system of trenches, wire entanglements, and artillery positions. For the Russian army, taking these points meant the possibility of developing an offensive in the direction of Lviv and Lublin, which could radically change the balance of power on the entire Eastern Front. The Liman operation was conceived as part of the overall plan for the summer offensive, designed to draw German forces from the Western Front and support the Allies bleeding in the Battle of Verdun. By the start of the Liman operation, the opposing armies represented formidable forces, seasoned by 2 years of bloody battles. The Russian army fielded 3 armies with a total strength of about 400,000 bayonets and sabers. The core of the strike group consisted of the 8th and 11th armies under the command of Generals Kaledin and Sakharov, respectively. At their disposal were 1,600 guns of various calibers, including the newest heavy howitzers. After the Great Retreat of 1915, the Russian army managed to replenish its losses in weaponry and ammunition, although a shortage of shells was still felt. The morale of the soldiers was high. The successes of the Brusilov offensive instilled confidence in the possibility of victory. Opposing them were the forces of the Central Powers, the German army group of General Linsingen and the Austro-Hungarian army of Archduke Joseph Ferdinand, totaling about 350,000 men. The German units were distinguished by high discipline and excellent tactical training. The Austro-Hungarian troops, though inferior to the Germans in training, were well fortified in defensive positions. The enemy's artillery park numbered 1,400 guns, including powerful Krupp and Skoda mortars. Particularly effective were the German machine gun units, armed with reliable MG-08 machine guns. The Russian infantry was armed with Mosin rifles, which were simple and reliable, but inferior to German Mausers in rate of fire. The cavalry of both sides was armed with carbines, sabers, and lances, although its role in positional warfare was gradually diminishing. An important factor was the superiority of the Central Powers in heavy artillery and aviation. German and Austrian airplanes actively conducted reconnaissance, adjusted artillery fire, and carried out bombing raids on Russian positions. Russian aviation, despite the heroism of its pilots, suffered from a severe shortage of aircraft. Logistics also did not favor the Russian army. The narrow-gauge railways of Polesia hindered the delivery of ammunition and provisions, while the enemy relied on an extensive railway network. On the eve of the decisive clashes, both sides were completing their final preparations, understanding that the outcome of the battle could determine the fate of the entire summer campaign of 1916. The dawn of June 4, 1916 was unusually quiet. The silence hanging over the marshy plains around Stryk seemed an ominous premonition. At 5 o'clock in the morning, this silence was shattered by a deafening roar. Russian artillery opened a massive fire on the positions of Austro-Hungarian troops. Hundreds of guns of various calibers unleashed a barrage of shells upon the enemy, turning fortifications into a chaos of earth, concrete, and human bodies. The artillery preparation lasted 4 hours, unusually long by Eastern Front standards. General Kaledin decided not to economize on shells, understanding the strategic importance of the impending assault. German and Austrian soldiers, pinned to the ground in their dugouts, could only pray for survival under this metallic rain. By 9 o'clock in the morning, Russian infantry went on the attack. The assault groups moved first, elite soldiers armed with grenades and short entrenching tools. Behind them, in waves, came the main forces. Infantry regiments stretched for several kilometers along the front. Austrian machine gunners, who had survived the artillery bombardment, opened hurricane fire. Russian soldiers fell by the dozens but continued the offensive. By noon, advanced units reached the enemy's first line of trenches. Fierce hand-to-hand combat ensued. The Austrians resisted desperately, but the Russian pressure was too strong. By evening, the first line of defense had fallen, and Russian troops consolidated their positions. The German command, realizing the threat of a breakthrough, hastily transferred a reserve division from Kovel to Stryk. This division, consisting of experienced soldiers, was ordered to stop the Russian offensive at all costs. The next day, June 5th, Russian troops resumed attacks, striving to develop their success. However, German reserves had already taken up defensive positions. Heavy battles for the second line of fortifications ensued. A particularly fierce battle erupted for Hill 122, a dominant height overlooking the area. 3 times Russian infantrymen stormed this height, and 3 times they were repulsed with heavy losses. Only by the end of the day, after an artillery strike, was the height taken. The commander of the Austro-Hungarian forces, Archduke Joseph Ferdinand, understanding the danger of the situation, ordered all available reserves to be transferred to the threatened sector. On June 6th, the enemy launched a powerful counterattack. Thousands of Austrian and German soldiers, supported by artillery, descended upon Russian positions. Bloody battles ensued. For an entire day, positions changed hands. By evening, it became clear that the counterattack had failed. The Russians held their captured lines. On June 7th, the offensive continued. Russian troops, overcoming fierce resistance, slowly advanced towards Stryk. The German command, fearing the encirclement of its units, began withdrawing troops to pre-prepared positions. By the end of June 8th, the advanced units of the Russian army reached the outskirts of Stryk. The city had been turned into a fortress by the enemy. Every house became a strong point. Streets were blocked by barricades. Heavy street fighting began. Kovel, a small town in Volyn province, had acquired immense strategic importance by the summer of 1916. This railway hub connected 5 crucial directions, becoming a true gateway into the Central Powers' territory. Control over Kovel would open up the possibility for the Russian army to develop an offensive in several directions at once, dissecting the enemy front and disrupting its communications. General Brusilov, in developing his plan for the summer offensive, attached particular importance to the Kovel direction. In his memoirs, he wrote, "To accomplish this task, a strike group was formed under the command of General Bezobrazov, which included elite guards units. The German command was well aware of Kovel's strategic value. General Linsingen, commanding the army group, personally directed the fortification of this area. A deeply echeloned defense was created around the city, consisting of 3 strips of fortification. Each strip included 2 to 3 lines of full-profile trenches connected by communication passages. Multi-row wire obstacles, up to 30 meters wide, were installed in front of the forward edge. Particular attention was paid by the Germans to artillery positions. Heavy batteries were placed on concrete platforms, protected from aerial observation. To counter Russian cavalry, anti-tank ditches were dug and minefields laid in tank-vulnerable directions. The Kovel garrison numbered about 50,000 men, predominantly German troops, renowned for their steadfastness in defense. The Russian command developed a detailed plan for capturing this fortified area. The operation envisioned two converging strikes, from the south by the forces of General Kaledin's 8th Army, and from the east by the forces of General Lesh's 3rd Army. It was assumed that these strikes would allow the encirclement of the enemy's Kovel grouping and compel its surrender. A special role was assigned to the cavalry corps of Generals Hillerschmidt and Velyashev, who were to make a deep bypass of Kovel from the north, reach the enemy's communications, and cut off retreat routes. For breaking through fortified positions, a massive application of heavy artillery was planned, including the newest 12-inch howitzers, capable of destroying even concrete fortifications. Preparations for the assault were conducted under conditions of strict secrecy. The regrouping of troops was carried out predominantly at night, and camouflage measures were undertaken with particular thoroughness. However, German intelligence, relying on aerial observation data and prisoner testimonies, managed to uncover the Russian command's intentions. The Battle of Liman became a classic example of maneuver warfare, where the tactical decisions of the command determined the outcome of battles. General Brusilov, who led the operation from the Russian side, applied an innovative approach to breaking through enemy defenses. Instead of concentrating forces on a narrow section of the front, he distributed strikes along the entire line of contact with the enemy. This prevented the German and Austro-Hungarian commands from timely redeploying reserves to threatened areas. Particularly effective was the decision of General Kaledin, commander of the 8th Army, regarding a night maneuver in the area of Hill 143. Two infantry divisions, having made a 30-kilometer forced march through swampy terrain, outflanked the Austrian positions. The enemy, not expecting an attack from this direction, was forced to retreat hastily, abandoning fortified lines. The German command, realizing the threat of encirclement, undertook a daring counter-maneuver. General Linsingen brought two fresh divisions out of reserve and launched a surprise attack on the stretched communications of the Russian army. This move almost led to disaster. The supply of forward units was threatened. The situation was saved by the determination of General Keller, commander of the 3rd Cavalry Corps, who, with the forces of his Cossack regiments, repelled the breakthrough enemy. During the battles for Kovel, the Russian command made a serious mistake by not ensuring proper coordination between the advancing armies. The 8th and 3rd armies acted disjointedly, which allowed the Germans to defeat them piecemeal. General Lesch, commanding the 3rd Army, prepared his artillery for bombardment for too long, missing the moment for a decisive strike. The Austro-Hungarian command, in the person of Archduke Joseph Ferdinand, demonstrated tactical flexibility by employing a layered defense with active use of counterattacks. Particularly effective was the system of feigned retreats, luring advancing Russian units into the crossfire of disguised machine gun nests. In the Stryk region, one of the first instances in the history of the Eastern Front of successful interaction between infantry, artillery, and aviation occurred. German airplanes adjusted the fire of heavy batteries, which allowed them to hit Russian reserves and artillery positions with high accuracy. The Russian command was unable to organize effective countermeasures against enemy aviation. The human cost of the Liman operation was truly horrifying. According to preserved archival documents, the Russian army lost about 75,000 men killed, wounded, and missing in action. Losses were particularly heavy in the guards units that stormed the Kovel fortifications, up to 60% of personnel. German and Austro-Hungarian forces lost a total of about 68,000 soldiers and officers, with Austrian units suffering the heaviest damage. Conditions for the wounded were catastrophic. Field hospitals, located in hastily adapted peasant huts and tents, could not cope with the influx of casualties. Dr. Sergei Fedotov, who served in a dressing station of the 11th Army, left stunning memoirs. The wounded lay directly on straw, covered with tarpaulin. Blood soaked this bedding, creating an unbearable smell. Operations had to be performed by the light of kerosene lamps, often without anesthesia, which quickly ran out. Moans and screams did not stop day or night. It was especially difficult for those who received wounds in marshy terrain. Dirty water, getting into wounds, caused blood poisoning and gangrene. Due to a shortage of medicines, doctors often had to resort to amputations as the only way to save a wounded person's life. Sanitary trains, evacuating the wounded to rear hospitals, were overcrowded. Lieutenant Alexei Brusilov, nephew of the famous general, recalled, "In a car designed for 28 people, up to 60 wounded were placed. Many died en route from blood loss and infection." Participants in the battles left stunning testimonies of the mass deaths of soldiers. Non-commissioned officer Vasily Karpov wrote in a letter home, "Our company went on the attack with 180 men, and only 37 of us returned. The rest remained lying in front of the German wire entanglements. The ground was literally soaked with blood." German Lieutenant Otto Weidel noted in his diary, "The Russians came at our machine guns wave after wave. We mowed them down like grass, but they kept advancing. It was not a battle, but a real slaughter." In the area of Height 122, for which particularly fierce battles were fought, more than 3,000 dead from both sides were counted after the battle. Local residents continued to find the remains of fallen soldiers in the surrounding forests and swamps for many years. The Liman operation became a true laboratory of military art, where the newest types of weaponry underwent their baptism of fire. Artillery, rightly called the god of war, played a decisive role in these bloody battles. The Russian army employed over 1,600 guns of various calibers, from light 3-inchers to powerful 12-inch howitzers. Particularly effective were new models of 6-inch field howitzers, capable of destroying concrete fortifications and enemy dugouts. The Germans countered them with their famous Big Berthas, 420mm Krupp mortars, which struck terror into Russian soldiers. Artillery duels sometimes lasted for days, turning the landscape into a lunar scene of craters and shattered fortifications. Austrian artilleryman Franz Huber recalled, "The earth trembled incessantly, as if during an earthquake. It seemed as if hell itself had opened up beneath us." A true revolution was the mass use of machine guns. German machine gun crews, armed with reliable MG-08s, could mow down an entire chain of attackers with a single pull of the trigger. Russian machine gunners used both domestic Maxims and Allied-supplied British Lewises and French Hotchkiss. It was machine guns that turned the battlefield into a veritable meat grinder, nullifying the numerical superiority of the attacking side. One well-placed machine gun could hold a front several hundred meters wide. Lieutenant Colonel Nikolai Morozov wrote in his report, "The enemy's machine gun fire literally pinned us to the ground. It was impossible to raise one's head without the risk of being shot." For the first time on the Eastern Front, mortars were used on a significant scale. These short-barreled indirect fire weapons proved indispensable for hitting personnel in trenches and dugouts. Particularly effective were German Minenwerfer mortars of 210mm caliber, capable of throwing 5 Pud mines up to 800 meters. The Russian army experienced a severe shortage of this type of weapon, which significantly reduced its combat capabilities. Aviation, though still in its infancy, was already beginning to play a noticeable role. German and Austrian airplanes conducted reconnaissance, adjusted artillery fire, and even bombed Russian positions. Russian pilots in outdated machines heroically resisted them, but the enemy's numerical and technical superiority was evident. A new word in military affairs was the use of flamethrowers. German assault groups, armed with this terrible weapon, burned Russian soldiers out of fortifications. A stream of burning mixture reached 30 meters, penetrating embrasures and communication trenches. Gas masks did not save from this weapon. Fire devoured everything in its path. The Russian command, shocked by the effectiveness of flamethrowers, hastily formed its own flamethrower teams. The Liman operation was evidence that the era of mass bayonet charges was becoming a thing of the past. New types of weaponry fundamentally changed the nature of war, making it increasingly mechanized and merciless. War is not only a clash of armies on the battlefield, but also a complex logistical challenge. The Liman operation clearly demonstrated how supply problems can determine the outcome of battles no less than the heroism of soldiers or the talent of commanders. Stretched communications and the impassable roads of Volyn Polesia turned into a real nightmare for the quartermaster services of both warring parties. The Russian army faced a critical shortage of artillery shells already in the second week of the offensive. According to General Brusilov's memoirs, quote, "Zero, narrow-gauge railways could not cope with the flow of goods," quote, and horse-drawn transport got stuck in the marshy terrain. The soldiers joked grimly. Food supply also left much to be desired. The quartermaster of the 8th Army, Colonel Semyonov, wrote in his report, quote, 2. The advanced units that broke deep into the enemy's defenses found themselves in an especially difficult situation. Guard regiments near Kovel, surrounded by German units, were forced to conserve every dry biscuit and every cartridge. The medical support of Russian troops also encountered serious difficulties. A shortage of dressings, medicines, and surgical instruments was felt everywhere. The wounded were evacuated on peasant carts along rain-soaked roads, which significantly increased mortality. The German and Austro-Hungarian armies were in a more advantageous position due to a developed railway network and better organization of rear services. An extensive system of narrow-gauge railways, built by German engineers directly to the front line, ensured uninterrupted delivery of everything necessary. German field mail worked especially effectively, maintaining the morale of the soldiers. Every German soldier regularly received letters and parcels from home, while Russian soldiers sometimes went for months without news from their relatives. Nevertheless, even German logistics experienced failures. Austrian officer Karl Steiner recalled, "Our soldiers starved no less than the Russians. Supplies were often delayed due to the actions of Cossack patrols cutting communications." Both sides actively used automobile transport, but the condition of the roads made its use extremely limited. Russian Russo-Balt trucks and French Renault trucks often got stuck in the mud, becoming easy prey for German airplanes. Logistical difficulties directly affected the combat capabilities of the parties. The shortage of shells forced Russian artillery to conserve fire, which reduced the effectiveness of artillery preparation. Interruptions in food supply undermined the physical strength of the soldiers, making them less steadfast in defense and less decisive in offense. The experience of the Liman operation clearly showed that in modern warfare, victory is achieved not only by those who fight more bravely, but also by those who better organize the supply of their troops. The turning point in the Liman operation occurred on the 10th day of fierce fighting. The morning of June 14, 1916, began with a powerful artillery strike by Russian heavy artillery on enemy fortifications in the area of height 137. More than 200 large-caliber guns concentrated their fire on a front sector only 2 kilometers wide. German dugouts and machine gun nests were literally swept from the face of the earth. This artillery strike was made possible by the bold decision of General Kaledin. He ordered the removal of some guns from other sectors of the front, risking their weakening. Taking advantage of the enemy's demoralization, Russian infantry went on the offensive without the usual artillery preparation, which came as a complete surprise to the German command. Siberian rifle regiments, famous for their steadfastness, broke through the first line of defense in a matter of hours. By noon, a breach about 3 kilometers wide had formed in the German positions. The German command, realizing the threat of a complete front breakthrough, urgently transferred its last reserves, the elite Prussian Guard, to the threatened sector. However, it was already too late. General Krymov's Russian cavalry, standing by, rushed into the breach. Cossack regiments, deploying in a lava formation, crashed into the retreating German units. Panic began. Austrian units, located on the left flank of the breakthrough, could not withstand the onslaught and began a disorderly retreat. The decisive moment came on the evening of the same day when Russian troops reached the key bridge over the Stockhod River. The capture of this crossing opened the way to Kovel from the south. The Germans desperately defended the bridge, understanding its strategic importance. 3 times Russian battalions stormed the crossing, and 3 times they rolled back, suffering heavy losses. The situation changed thanks to the heroic act of Lieutenant Vasilevsky, who, with a group of volunteers, swam across the river under the cover of dusk and attacked the German positions from the rear. The suddenness of this attack decided the outcome of the battle. The bridge was captured. In the northern sector of the front, in the Kovel area, the turning point occurred thanks to the successful application of the rolling barrage tactic. Russian artillery consistently shifted fire deep into the enemy's defenses, while infantry advanced behind the shell bursts at a distance of only 100 to 200 meters. This tactic, applied on such a scale for the first time, allowed for minimizing losses when breaking through fortified positions. A key factor that determined the outcome of the battle was the German command's loss of operational control over its troops. Russian radio intercepts and the actions of sabotage groups disrupted communication between General Linsingen's headquarters and the frontline units. As a result, German divisions acted disjointedly, without a unified plan. The superiority of the Russians in manpower also played a decisive role. By mid-June, Stavka had transferred additional reinforcements to the Liman area, fresh Siberian divisions that had not participated in previous battles. These units, thrown into the breakthrough, ensured a numerical advantage at key points of the battle. An important psychological moment was the surrender of an entire battalion of Czech soldiers fighting as part of the Austro-Hungarian army into Russian captivity. This event demoralized the remaining Slavic enemy units and provoked mass surrender. The Battle of Liman radically altered the front line in the Eastern Theater of Operations. By the end of June 1916, Russian forces had advanced 15 to 30 kilometers deep along a front spanning over 100 kilometers. This breakthrough created a salient that deeply penetrated the Central Powers' positions, disrupting their defensive system. The strategic implications of this front-line shift proved multifaceted. First and foremost, the German command was forced to urgently transfer 6 divisions from the Western Front to the Eastern Front. alleviating pressure on French positions near Verdun. General Falkenhayn, chief of the German General Staff, admitted in his report to the Kaiser, "The Austro-Hungarian army suffered particularly heavy losses. The loss of the key railway hubs of Stryk and Kovel disrupted the supply system and complicated the maneuvering of reserves." Emperor Franz Joseph was so alarmed by the situation that he sent a personal message to his German ally requesting additional support. For the Russian command, the success of the Liman operation opened up new opportunities. General Brusilov developed an ambitious plan for a further offensive, envisioning the development of the attack in the direction of Lviv and Lublin. These cities held not only military but also immense political significance. Their capture could lead to Austria-Hungary's withdrawal from the war. However, the change in the front line also created certain problems for the Russian army. The formed salient was vulnerable to flanking attacks by the enemy. Stretched communications hampered the supply of forward units. Quartermaster General of the Stavka, Pustovoytenko, noted in his report, "The success of the offensive created the threat of a tactical victory escalating into a strategic defeat due to logistical problems." The German command quickly recognized this vulnerability. General Hindenburg, who replaced Falkenhayn as chief of the General Staff, developed a counteroffensive plan that envisioned delivering 2 converging strikes at the base of the Russian salient with the aim of encircling the breakthrough units. The change in the front line also affected the plans of Russia's allies. The French command, taking advantage of the weakened German pressure near Verdun, began preparations for an offensive on the Somme. The British Expeditionary Force also intensified its actions, seeking to capitalize on the success of their Russian allies. The movement of the front line also changed the situation of the local population. Thousands of refugees fled eastward, escaping the hostilities. The Russian command was forced to organize humanitarian aid and the evacuation of civilians, which placed an additional burden on the military infrastructure. The outcome of the Battle of Liman provoked a strong reaction in Poland and Germany, sparking intense discussions about the future of the region. Polish political circles received the news with mixed feelings. On the one hand, the defeat of the Central Powers opened up prospects for the revival of Polish statehood. On the other hand, the advance of Russian troops raised concerns about post-war borders. The Warsaw Committee of National Unity issued a memorandum stating, "The battles in Volyn Polesia could determine the fate of the Polish people for decades to come. We cannot remain indifferent observers when the question of our lands is being decided." The German military command held a series of emergency meetings, analyzing the reasons for the failure and developing measures to stabilize the front. General Ludendorff, in his report to the Kaiser, emphasized, "The loss of Kovel poses a threat to the entire Eastern Front. It is necessary to immediately transfer additional divisions, even at the cost of temporarily weakening our positions in the West." Sharp debates unfolded in the Reichstag. The conservative wing demanded increased military efforts and the mobilization of the last reserves. The Social Democrats, on the contrary, used the failures on the front as an argument in favor of peace negotiations. Deputy Philipp Scheidemann openly declared, "Every new battle brings us closer to catastrophe. How many more German mothers must receive death notices before the government recognizes the futility of continuing the war?" Particular alarm in German ruling circles was caused by the influence of the Battle of Liman on the Allies. Austria-Hungary, having suffered the heaviest losses, was on the verge of military exhaustion. The German ambassador in Vienna reported growing anti-war sentiments and the strengthening of separatist tendencies among the national minorities of the Habsburg Empire. In the Polish territories under German occupation, the military administration tightened control, fearing pro-Russian demonstrations. At the same time, a propaganda campaign was intensified, promising Poles autonomy within a future Central Europe under German patronage. On November 5, 1916, largely in response to events on the Eastern Front, the German and Austro-Hungarian monarchs issued a manifesto on the creation of the Kingdom of Poland, a satellite state under the control of the Central Powers. This step was intended to attract the Polish population to the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary, as well as to create a buffer against a possible further advance of Russian troops. Diplomatic circles in Sweden and Denmark closely monitored the developments, fearing a change in the balance of power in the Baltic Sea region. Swedish Foreign Minister Knut Wallenberg noted in a secret memorandum, "The successes of the Russian army in Volhynia could lead to a revision of the entire map of Eastern Europe, which directly affects the interests of the Scandinavian countries." The Liman operation became a serious test not only for the warring armies, but also for diplomatic relations between the Allies. The Russian command and political leadership carefully analyzed the role of Western Entente partners in the context of these bloody battles. The results of this analysis evoked mixed feelings in Petrograd. General Alexeyev, Chief of Staff of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, noted in his report to the Tsar, "While our soldiers shed blood in the swamps of Volhynia, our allies limit themselves to symbolic actions on their fronts." Particular dissatisfaction was caused by the absence of the promised offensive by French and British troops, which was supposed to draw German reserves from the Eastern Front. Foreign Minister Sazonov, in a conversation with the ambassadors of France and Great Britain, did not hide his disappointment. "We expected coordinated actions, but received only assurances of solidarity." French Ambassador Maurice Paléologue, in his memoirs, acknowledged the fairness of these claims. "The Russians had every right to reproach us for insufficient activity. Their sacrifices at Kovel saved Verdun, but this fact was not properly appreciated in Paris. The Battle of Liman became a turning point in Russia's relations with its allies. For the first time, the Russian leadership openly spoke of the possibility of a separate peace with Germany, if the support of the Western powers did not become more substantial. These conversations, although they did not become an official position, seriously alarmed London and Paris. British Prime Minister Asquith, in a secret dispatch to Lord Kitchener, wrote, "Criticism from Russian military circles was particularly sharp. General Brusilov, who directly led the Liman operation, noted in his report to Stavka, the assessments of Allied material aid were no less critical. Russia was in dire need of artillery shells, rifles, and machine guns, but supplies were greatly delayed." Quartermaster General Pustovoitenko reported, quote, "However, not all assessments were negative. Stavka understood that the Allies faced their own difficulties. Colonel Ignatiev, Russia's military attaché in France, emphasized in his dispatches, "The French army is exhausted by months of fighting at Verdun. To demand an immediate offensive from it would be unrealistic." The Battle of Liman also affected economic relations with the Allies. Finance Minister Bark used information about the casualties of the Russian army as an argument in negotiations for new loans. As a result, Great Britain agreed to provide an additional loan of £50 million for the purchase of military equipment. An important consequence was the strengthening of military technical cooperation. After the Liman operation, British and French military missions in Russia were expanded. The Allies sent instructors to train Russian officers in modern methods of warfare. The experience of using artillery and aviation was particularly valuable. The Battle of Liman taught Russia's Western allies invaluable lessons in mass mobilization. French and British military observers, present at General Brusilov's headquarters, meticulously documented the Russian army's experience in transferring and deploying large military formations under the difficult conditions of the Volyn Polesia. Colonel Henri Laverne, head of the French military mission, noted in his report to the Minister of War, quote, "British analysts paid particular attention to the system of replenishing forward units." Major Alfred Knox wrote to London, "French military theorists drew valuable lessons from the experience of Russian field medicine. In conditions of mass casualties, Russian doctors applied a system of sorting the wounded, which allowed for optimal use of limited medical resources. This approach was subsequently introduced into the French army and saved thousands of lives in the battles on the Somme." The Liman operation forced Western allies to reconsider their views on the logistical support of large offensive operations. British General Haig, analyzing the reasons for the slowdown of the Russian offensive, concluded that it was necessary to create a multi-level supply system with intermediate depots and reserve transport routes. The experience of Russian artillery proved particularly valuable for the French. The method of sequential fire transfer, used near Kovel, was thoroughly studied and improved by French artillerymen. General Pétain personally ordered the implementation of this tactic in preparation for the offensive on Verdun. The Battle of Liman showed the Western Allies the need for more thorough reserve training. The Russian army, despite heavy losses, managed to maintain its offensive potential thanks to well-trained marching battalions. The British command, impressed by this experience, accelerated the formation of the so-called, quote, two volunteer formations intended for large-scale offensive operations. French military theorists were particularly interested in the psychological aspects of mass mobilization. Captain Jacques Rivière, a military psychologist at Marshal Joffre's headquarters, studied methods of maintaining the morale of Russian soldiers in conditions of prolonged fighting and limited supplies. His recommendations formed the basis of a new system of troop rotation and rest introduced into the French army in the autumn of 1916. British observers were impressed by the Russian command's ability to improvise in conditions of industrial resource scarcity. Field workshops, organized directly behind the front line, repaired damaged weapons, and even produced simple ammunition. This experience was partially adopted by the British Army in preparation for the Battle of the Somme. Today, the battlefields of the Liman operation look entirely different from how they did over a century ago. The quiet fields and forests of Volyn Polesia preserve the memory of those terrible days of 1916. At the site of the bloody battles for Hill 137, a modest obelisk of gray granite now stands. Inscribed on it are the words, "To the fallen heroes of the Great War." Annually, on the anniversary of the start of the Liman operation, historians, local lore experts, and descendants of the battle participants gather here to honor the memory of the fallen. The largest memorial complex is located on the outskirts of modern Kovel. The central composition is a bronze sculpture of a soldier, his head bowed over the graves of his comrades. Around it are granite slabs with the names of the regiments that participated in the battle. Particularly moving is the Alley of Remembrance, where birch trees are planted, one for each day of the battle. In Stryk, remnants of Austrian fortifications have been preserved, concrete bunkers, partially destroyed by time but still bearing traces of those distant events. Local authorities have transformed this area into an open-air museum, where visitors can see reconstructions of trenches and dugouts. In Russia, the memory of the Liman operation is immortalized in several museum exhibits. These events are particularly fully presented in the Central Museum of the Armed Forces in Moscow, where personal belongings of battle participants, documents, and photographs are kept. In Germany, the attitude towards the Battle of Liman was long controversial. During the years of the Weimar Republic, these events were viewed as an example of senseless sacrifices of an imperialist war. During the Nazi period, they preferred not to recall them as they did not fit into the myth of the invincibility of German arms. Only in post-war West Germany did the first objective studies dedicated to these battles appear. In modern Poland, the memory of the Liman operation is closely linked to national history. For Poles, these events symbolize a turning point, after which the process of restoring an independent Polish state began. A special section is dedicated to these events in the Warsaw Military History Museum. Austria and Hungary, as heirs of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, preserve the memory of their soldiers who died in the Volyn swamps. In Vienna and Budapest, memorial plaques have been installed with the names of officers who fell in those battles. Commemorative services are held annually. Search teams play an important role in preserving historical memory. Every year they find the remains of fallen soldiers, unexploded shells, and personal belongings of battle participants. Thanks to their work, hundreds of nameless heroes regain their names, and their descendants find graves to visit. Despite its local nature, the Liman operation had a profound impact on the entire course of the First World War. These bloody battles in the marshy plains of Volhynia became a turning point, altering the strategic situation on the Eastern Front and reverberating across all theaters of war. The success of Russian troops in the Stryk and Kovel area forced the German High Command to radically reevaluate its priorities. 6 full-strength divisions, transferred from the Western to the Eastern Front, weakened German pressure on Verdun, allowing the French to catch their breath and prepare a counterattack. Marshal Joffre explicitly admitted in his memoirs, "We owe the salvation of Verdun to our Russian allies, whose heroic attacks in the Liman area drew off significant enemy forces." The Liman operation changed the balance of power within the Triple Alliance. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, having suffered catastrophic losses, was on the brink of military exhaustion. Emperor Franz Joseph was forced to effectively hand over operational control of his troops to the German command, which increased Vienna's dependence on Berlin. This led to increased tension between the Allies and exacerbated the internal political crisis in the multinational Habsburg Empire. For the post-war arrangement of Europe, the battles at Liman held special significance. It was here that the phenomenon of mass defection of Czechoslovak and Polish soldiers serving in the Austro-Hungarian army to the Russian side first manifested itself. These volunteers subsequently formed the core of the national armies of independent states that arose from the ruins of empires. Professor Tomáš Masaryk of Charles University, the future president of Czechoslovakia, called the Battle of Liman the first step towards the national liberation of the Slavic peoples of Central Europe. The Battle of Liman became a peculiar laboratory of military art. Tactical techniques first tested here, such as the rolling barrage and echeloned attack, were subsequently adopted by all belligerents. French General Pétain personally studied reports of the Russian offensive and implemented elements of this tactic when planning operations on the Western Front. These battles had a profound impact on public consciousness. In Russia, the initial patriotic fervor caused by successes at the front gradually gave way to disillusionment due to enormous losses and the inability to build on the achieved success. This fueled anti-war sentiments and contributed to the growing revolutionary crisis. For Germany and Austria-Hungary, the defeat near Kovel was a psychological blow, that undermined faith in the invincibility of the Central Powers. In the long run, the Liman operation changed the geopolitical map of Eastern Europe. The borders established after the war at the Paris Peace Conference largely took into account the front line that had formed after these battles. The territories for which so much blood was spilled became part of independent Poland, whose rebirth as a state was one of the key outcomes of the First World War. The lessons of the Battle of Liman remain relevant today. Military theorists continue to study the experience of these battles, especially in aspects of coordinating large military formations and the interaction of various branches of service in complex conditions.